In December 1986, a task force of federal and local agents started watching a man in Jacksonville, Florida. They did not knock on his door. They did not make an arrest. They watched. For 15 months, they watched. What they eventually built from that surveillance became a 95-count federal indictment. The name at the top of it was Henry L. Manns. Here's the number that reorients everything else in this story. He was 23 years old when the surveillance began, not a veteran of the game in his 30s who had spent a decade building up to this level, 23. And by the time that investigation concluded and the indictment came down, he was controlling an estimated 30% of Jacksonville's crack cocaine market, generating over $10 million a year and operating a distribution network that crossed state lines. By the time he was 25, a federal judge had sentenced him to life in prison. But that is not where the story ends. Not even close. The federal record that describes Henry Mann's operation does not describe a corner hustle that got too big for its own good. It describes something that looks, in its organizational structure, far more like a company than like a street crew. The product sourcing ran to Fort Lauderdale and the surrounding South Florida supply network. Powder cocaine, not street-level cut products, the real thing, traced by federal investigators back to supply routes they had been monitoring across South Florida. A man named Gerald Wells was one of Manns's South Florida connections. A man named Michael Parks handled the physical transportation, hauling product north on Interstate 95 into Jacksonville, where it was cooked into crack and distributed through Manns's network. The distribution hub was a storefront called Mann's Confectionery, a candy store in name, a crack distribution operation in practice. Richard Nixon ran it on the ground, handled the street dealers, managed the product flow out to the network. Michael Keeley was Manns's right-hand man, the person closest to the daily operations. Manns's brother, Emmett Lamar Manns, functioned as co-principal, the second in command across the whole enterprise. The reach of the operation extended beyond Jacksonville. Federal prosecutors established at trial that a man named Jimmy Lee Nixon, Richard's father, was one of Mann's Georgia contractors, buying product from the Manns brothers to resell across the state line. Henry Manns was running a multi-state distribution network at 23 years old, and he had organized it with a specificity that the federal investigation would eventually document in painstaking detail. The neighborhood where the operation ran matters for understanding the full context of what happened in Jacksonville in 1986. Durkeeville in northwest Jacksonville was once the commercial and civic heart of Black Jacksonville. Myrtle Avenue was where the Black community built its own economy under segregation. Doctors, lawyers, banks, churches, institutions that served a community that the white city largely refused to serve. By the 1980s, decades of disinvestment had hollowed all of that out. Integration had redirected Black commercial energy toward previously excluded spaces without replacing what it left behind. Federal highway construction had cut through the neighborhood's physical geography. The institutions were gone. What remained was a community that had been abandoned by the legitimate economy, and then, at precisely the moment when that abandonment left it most vulnerable, was hit by the crack epidemic. Henry Manns did not destroy a thriving community. He built his operation inside a neighborhood that the legitimate economy had already left. That is not a defense of what the operation did to the people who bought the product and became addicted to it. Crack cocaine devastated families in Durkeeville the same way it devastated families in every other community it touched, and the people who built the distribution networks that moved it bear real responsibility for that devastation. But the context of how a 23-year-old from that neighborhood came to see crack distribution as an available opportunity is a context that the federal indictment does not capture, and that the story of Jacksonville's drug era cannot be told honestly without. Jacksonville in the mid-1980s was not unique in this respect, but it had its own particular version of the same national pattern. Cities across the country that had built segregated Black commercial districts in the early 20th century watched those districts hollow out through the 1960s and 1970s as legal segregation ended and the professionals and institutions that had anchored those neighborhoods moved toward integration elsewhere, often without the capital or the customer base to sustain what was left behind. Add federal urban renewal projects that routed interstate construction directly through black neighborhoods in city after city, Jacksonville among them, and what remained by the time crack arrived in the mid-1980s was a landscape with the physical shell of a commercial district and almost none of the underlying economy that had once supported it. Mann's Confectionery, as a storefront, sat on a street that 30 years earlier would have been lined with black-owned businesses serving a captive, segregated customer base. By 1986, that same storefront could function as a crack house because there was very little competing economic activity left on the block to notice or to compete with it. The investigation that brought Mann's down was a 15-month federal operation that demonstrated exactly why the most significant drug prosecutions of the era were federal rather than state. 10 months into the investigation, law enforcement applied for a wiretap, not on Mann's directly. They tapped the phone at the Orange Park residence of Keeley and Richard Nixon. The application supporting that tap was a 108-page affidavit written by a detective named Charles L. Porter. 108 pages of documented evidence, and they were still watching, still building, still not ready to move. They got the tap approved. They extended it 30 additional days. They also tapped the phone at Mann's Confectionery itself. 2 active wiretaps running simultaneously, one on the residence of Mann's key associates, one inside the distribution front. Every call documenting product needs, delivery arrangements, payment discussions, and operational logistics was being recorded. Confidential informants were simultaneously conducting controlled buys at the confectionery, cash change in hands for product, and transactions that federal agents were observing and documenting. When agents eventually executed a search warrant on Mann's Confectionery itself, they recovered 34 grams of crack cocaine on the premises, along with semi-automatic weapons and ammunition, physical confirmation of what the wiretaps had already been describing in conversation for months. The candy store was not a metaphor investigators used loosely. It was, by the time of the raid, a documented armed narcotics distribution point operating behind a storefront that sold candy to children during the day. The arrest came not through a raid or a tip, but through a phone call the agents intercepted. Mann's was in Fort Lauderdale. He had product. He was coming back. The call gave agents an approximate departure time and his expected route, which they already knew was Interstate 95. They positioned themselves along the highway and waited. He drove into it, a rented car traveling at 81 miles per hour. When agents stopped the vehicle and searched the trunk, they found 2 kilograms of powdered cocaine along with jewelry that had been purchased under a fictitious name at the same time as the rental itself, a detail that later helped prosecutors establish the pattern of concealment running through the whole operation. He had driven directly into a trap built entirely from his own recorded words. That was not the only evidence assembled. In January 1987, Mann's and Keeley was stopped at Jacksonville Airport carrying $73,600 in cash with airline tickets to Fort Lauderdale purchased under false names. In February, a separate vehicle stop produced $6,000 in cash and a large quantity of gold jewelry. A Ferrari linked to Mann's was seized. Weapons were recovered across multiple incidents. And then there was the scene that the public record contains, but that gets almost no attention in any account of this case. Officers responding to reports of gunshots found Mann's, his brother Emmett, and Richard Nixon at the home of Mann's parents. When officers reached Mann's, he was wearing a flak jacket. Inside the flak jacket, 50 rounds of live ammunition. Numerous firearms were present at the location, and somewhere on the property, a live pipe bomb, a candy store, fake names on airline tickets, 2 kilograms in the trunk of a rental car, a flak jacket loaded with ammunition, a pipe bomb at his parents' house. Whatever Henry Mans thought was coming, he had prepared for it in a way that suggests he understood, somewhere in the back of his mind, that what he had built was not going to end quietly. The trial concluded in July 1988. 7 defendants, all convicted every single count. The sentencing that followed operated under the federal guidelines system that assigned numerical offense levels reflecting the severity of the conduct. Mans received an adjusted offense level of 44, the highest in the entire case. The trial judge had added 4 enhancement levels specifically for Mans, reflecting his role as the architect and leader of the entire enterprise. His brother Emmett received a 42. Keeley and Richard Nixon both received 39. The 2-point gap between Henry and his brother, minimal in human terms, meant the same outcome in legal terms, life. At the center of those sentences was a charge called continuing criminal enterprise under 21 United States Code Section 848. Federal law in that era required a mandatory life sentence for a CCE conviction. No parole, no judicial discretion. No matter what the judge thought about the specific defendant standing in front of him, the mandatory sentence had already been written before the trial began. The United States established at a later proceeding that Mans had been convicted of more than 40 felony counts in the 1988 case. Conspiracy counts, possession counts, trafficking counts, telephone facility counts, all stacked on top of that mandatory life anchor. All 7 defendants appealed, and the case that reached the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit reads today as a kind of masterclass in how thoroughly a well-built federal wiretap case can withstand challenge. The defendants argued jointly that the trial judge should have suppressed the wiretap evidence entirely and that it was improper to let jurors review transcripts of the recorded calls during deliberation. They also raised individual evidentiary challenges, arguing in various ways that the evidence tying each of them personally to the conspiracy was too thin to support a conviction. The appellate panel rejected every one of those arguments and affirmed the convictions and sentences across the board. Reading the appellate opinion today, what stands out is how little room the defense had to work with. A case built on 108 pages of wiretap affidavit, 2 separate taps, controlled buys, a search warrant that recovered crack and weapons on the premises, and a highway stop triggered by an intercepted phone call does not leave much daylight for an appellate court to find reversible error, and the 11th Circuit did not find any. The error that produced that outcome is worth naming directly. The mandatory minimum error, the era in which Congress removed judicial discretion from drug sentencing to send a message that the courts could not soften, that era has since been assessed by the same legislative bodies that created it as having gone too far. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 and the First Step Act of 2018 both represented Congress effectively acknowledging that certain sentencing practices from the 1980s had produced outcomes that the modern legislature would not reproduce. But those reforms were primarily built around crack cocaine sentencing disparities. Mans's operation moved powder cocaine, so the legal corrections that opened doors for thousands of other incarcerated men did not reach him the same way. He was 25 years old, more than 40 felony counts, a mandatory sentence written into the law before a single witness took the stand. For 19 years, Henry Mans was a federal inmate. The door that eventually opened for him in 2007 was not a door that any legal reform swung open. It was a door he opened himself by sitting down with federal prosecutors and giving them what they wanted. He cooperated. In the world he came from, that word carries specific and permanent weight. The streets do not use the word cooperated. They have a different word for it, and it is not a compliment. The specifics of what he provided, which investigations he helped build, whose names appeared in those cooperation sessions, none of it has ever been made public. The agreement is sealed. What the 2016 court record does reveal is a judge's notation that Mans had some notoriety in the drug business, meaning his name still meant something in Jacksonville even after 19 years, meaning the information he carried was current enough to be operationally useful, meaning someone in the federal system decided that what he could give was worth the trade, He was released in 2007. Within months of that release, he was back before a judge for violating the terms of his supervised release. The public record does not specify the nature of the violation. What it does specify is that the judge at his 2012 sentencing listed it as a documented factor, evidence of what the court characterized as repeated disregard for the terms of his conditional freedom. November 17, 2010, a McDonald's in Lake City, Florida, approximately an hour west of Jacksonville on Interstate 10. Henry Mans walked in and sat down. Across from him was a woman he knew and a man she introduced. The man was an undercover DEA agent presenting himself as a Mexican cocaine source. He was wearing a recording device. Every word of the conversation was captured. There is a detail in the public record that almost no account of this case mentions. When Mans first made contact with these undercover agents, he was not asking for cocaine. He was asking for high-grade marijuana. The agents told him marijuana was not available. The conversation then shifted toward cocaine, a substance with dramatically more severe federal sentencing consequences. His defense attorney later stood before the court and told the judge that he had advised Mans there might be a viable entrapment case. He had looked at the sequence of who steered whom toward what product and believed there was something worth arguing. Mans overruled his own attorney and insisted on pleading guilty. Then, at sentencing, he told the court he believed he had been entrapped. The judge did not accept that position. The sentencing hearing ran approximately 2 hours. Judge Timothy J. Corrigan laid out his reasoning across 5 factors: the quantity of cocaine involved, the criminal history, with more than 40 felony counts from 1988, plus the 2007 supervised release violation, the need to deter future conduct, the need to protect the public, and specifically the need for general deterrence, because Mans still carried enough name recognition in Jacksonville's drug world that his conduct sent signals beyond his individual case. Local press coverage of the sentencing quoted Judge Corrigan describing Mans bluntly as a seemingly unremorseful serial drug dealer, a phrase that ran in the Florida Times-Union alongside the same old photograph that had followed Mans's name through Jacksonville news coverage for decades, a picture from his 20s showing him draped in gold chains and holding stacks of cash, the visual shorthand the city's newspaper kept returning to whenever his name resurfaced. The judge sentenced him to 168 months for the new conviction, plus a consecutive 12 months for the supervised release violation. 180 months total, 15 years. Mans was 48 years old when he went back inside. The mandatory minimum attached to the underlying half-kilogram cocaine charge alone was 10 years, meaning even without any of the enhancements tied to his history, Mans was never walking out of that courtroom with anything close to a short sentence. The judge said at sentencing that he was hopeful, even anticipating that this would finally be the end of Mans's drug dealing. The sentence math, accounting for good time credit and programming, points toward a release date somewhere around 2024 or 2025. Mans would have been in his early 60s. He appears to have gotten out. He has a website and an Instagram account. He is actively findable by anyone with a phone and a search engine. His son, Henry Mans Jr., who has a social media presence of his own, has organized a community event called Duval Day on Myrtle Avenue in Durkeeville for several consecutive years, going back to at least 2023, with postmarking gatherings in 2023, 2024, and again in July 2025. Each year, the event returns to the same stretch of Myrtle Avenue that was the commercial spine of the neighborhood where his father built his operation nearly 40 years earlier. And each year, by the account of the social media posts documenting it, hundreds of people show up. In December 2025, Henry L. Mans published a book. The title is A Story Only a Fool Could Tell. 216 pages, self-published, available for purchase. The publisher's own description frames it as an urban fiction novel, a street literature story rooted in real-life experience rather than a straightforward memoir, though the marketing leans heavily on the overlap between the fictional narrative and Manz's own biography. His website describes him as a thinker, a hustler, and a survivor who turned his life experiences into literature. He has said the book is the first in a planned series. The same year, his name surfaced in a local news report about a Jacksonville nonprofit called J. White Community Development Corp., which had received free surplus city land from the municipal government. Manz was listed as a vice president of the organization. The city noted, as cities do, his prior 1988 cocaine trafficking conviction. His involvement with the nonprofit had come after the organization was approved as a land grantee. Jacksonville had not forgotten him. The scrutiny followed him out. So which version of Henry Manz is the real one? The 23-year-old running a multi-state cocaine distribution network out of a candy store on Myrtle Avenue, who at 25 received a mandatory life sentence that no reform would ever fully reach, who spent 19 years inside before cooperating, who violated the terms of his supervised release, who sat across from an undercover DEA agent in a McDonald's at 47, who went back inside for 15 more years, who published a book in his 60s and shows up in city records as a nonprofit vice president. The answer is that there's not a version, there's a person, and the person contains all of it. The organizational intelligence that built the controlled distribution network at 23 was real. The damage that network did to the people who bought its product was also real. The mandatory sentence that removed any judicial discretion from his case, imposed in an era that the federal government has since acknowledged went too far, was real. The decision to go back into the McDonald's and have that conversation with the DEA agent after everything was real. The book on Myrtle Avenue is real. The news story about the nonprofit is real. What makes Henry Manz's case different from a lot of the stories told about 1980s drug kingpins is not any single fact in the record. It is the sheer length of the timeline and how many different institutions had a hand in shaping it. A federal sentencing structure wrote the first outcome before he was old enough to rent a car without a fake name attached to it. A cooperation agreement, sealed and never explained, wrote the second. A DEA sting operation run by agents who steered the conversation toward the substance most likely to send him back for a decade and a half, wrote the third. A judge's 5-factor sentencing calculus delivered with something close to resignation, wrote the fourth. And somewhere underneath all of that, a 23-year-old from a neighborhood the legitimate economy had already abandoned made a set of choices that no institution forced on him and that no amount of context erases. Both of those things are true in the same file. The federal government spent the better part of 4 decades responding to Henry Manz, revising the tools it used against him as the politics of drug sentencing shifted underneath the case, and Manz spent the better part of 4 decades responding back, first by building, then by surviving, then eventually by writing it down. There is also something worth sitting with in the fact that Jacksonville never let him become a purely historical figure the way some kingpins from that era eventually do, flattened into a single old newspaper photograph and nothing else. The same paper that ran the gold chains and stacks of cash photograph in 1988 was still writing about him in 2012, still writing about him when the nonprofit story broke, and the same neighborhood that watched federal agents tear through Man's confectionery in 1987 is the neighborhood that now hosts an annual block party organized by his son on the same street. Both of those facts sit inside the same zip code. Jacksonville did not forget Henry Manz, and Henry Manz, by every visible sign, did not try particularly hard to disappear. A man who spent 19 years in federal custody, went back for 15 more, and chose on his release to write a book, launch a website, and stand next to his son at a public event on Myrtle Avenue is a man who decided at some point that the story was worth telling out loud rather than burying. Whether that decision reflects genuine reckoning Simple unwillingness to hide, or something in between, is not a question the public record can answer. It is a question only Henry Mans can answer, and even then, only for himself. There is a broader pattern here too, one that shows up again and again in cities that lived through the mandatory minimum era. The men and women sentenced under those laws did not simply serve time and vanish into private life once released. Many of them came home to the same blocks, the same family networks, and in some cases, the same reputations that had defined them decades earlier, because federal sentences that stretch across 20 or 30 years do not erase a hometown's memory, they just put it on hold. Mans's return to Myrtle Avenue, his son's decision to keep organizing an event there, and the local paper's habit of reaching back for the same 1980s photograph every time his name resurfaces are all symptoms of the same underlying facts. A sentence can end, but the place where the story happened does not get a clean slate along with it. A story only a fool could tell. He left the judgment of who the fool is to the reader. That is probably the most honest thing in the whole story.